Thank you, Chairman Warren and Ranking Member Van Hollen. Thanks for holding this hearing. Welcome, General Bondi.
Thank you, sir.
Good to see you. I want to raise with you something that's been deeply concerning to me, General Bondi. The 2024 Democrat nominee for Vice President actually called federal immigration agents Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo. This is dangerous for our agents, it's wrong, and it cuts against and it undercuts the rule of law. So I want to ask you a series of questions, General Bondi, and if you would accommodate me, I would appreciate it. First, you'll agree when a bill is passed by Congress and signed by the President, it's law, right?
Yes, Senator.
And until that law is changed by Congress, you have a duty to follow it, right? That's what the rule of law is.
Yes, Senator.
So let me read the law.
We need to talk about something absolutely extraordinary that just happened in federal court, and the ramifications of this are nothing short of explosive. Attorney General Pam Bondi has just been handed what can only be described as a devastating 1-2 punch from the federal judiciary. And what's emerging from these rulings is deeply troubling. We're not talking about minor procedural setbacks or technical legal disputes that get resolved on appeal. No, what we're looking at here are findings of systematic misconduct, unlawful exercises of power, and potential criminal behavior, all documented in official court records by federal judges who don't mince words. Two separate federal judges have issued rulings that don't just dismiss the cases Bondi's Justice Department brought against James Comey and Letitia James. These rulings systematically tear apart the entire legal apparatus that was constructed to pursue what many observers are characterizing as politically motivated revenge prosecutions.
Your department has failed to respond to any of the 9 inquiries I have made and have responded to only 2 of 38 letters sent by my colleagues, the ranking members of the Senate and House Judiciary Committees, Senator Durbin and Congressman Raskin. So, Madam Attorney General, we have much to discuss this morning. I look forward to your testimony.
Senator Van Hollen, thank you. General Bondi, you're now recognized for your statement.
The judges didn't simply say not guilty or case dismissed. They went further, much further, documenting serious flaws in how these prosecutions were conceived, authorized, and executed from the very beginning. Let's start with the foundation because this is where everything begins to crumble. Senior Judge Cameron McGowan Curry examined the appointment of Lindsay Halligan, the interim U.S. attorney who was specifically selected by Bondi and Trump to handle these high-profile prosecutions targeting their political adversaries. And what Judge Curry discovered should send shockwaves through anyone who cares about the rule of law and proper legal procedure. Halligan's appointment as interim U.S. attorney was unlawful from the very start. She never had the legal authority to act in that capacity. Now, this isn't some minor technicality we're talking about. Federal law establishes very specific procedures for who can serve as a U.S. attorney and under what circumstances. These laws exist for critically important reasons. They prevent presidents from simply installing political allies or loyalists into these enormously powerful positions without proper oversight, Senate confirmation, or the institutional safeguards that are supposed to exist. These are positions that wield the full prosecutorial power of the federal government. The people who occupy them can destroy lives, bring criminal charges, seek imprisonment. That's why there are rules about who can hold these positions and how they get there. Judge Curry found that those rules weren't followed. The appointment was legally defective, and here's where it gets really significant, because Halligan lacked lawful authority to serve as U.S. attorney. Everything she did while purporting to act in that role was legally invalid. Every action she took, every document she signed, every indictment she secured, all of it represents what Judge Curry characterized as an unlawful exercise of executive power. The judge didn't leave any room for ambiguity here. The ruling states clearly that everything stemming from H. Halligan's defective appointment, including the indictments against Comey and James, must be dismissed. Think about the implications of this for a moment. The prosecutions targeting 2 of Donald Trump's most prominent critics, 2 individuals who Trump has publicly and repeatedly attacked and threatened. These prosecutions were built on a foundation that never legally existed in the first place. It's not that the evidence was weak or the legal theories were questionable, though we'll get to problems with those aspects shortly. It's that the entire prosecutorial authority being exercised was void from inception. It's as if someone who wasn't actually a lawyer tried to file legal documents, or someone who wasn't actually a judge tried to issue rulings. The basic threshold requirement for legal authority simply wasn't met. This raises obvious and troubling questions. How did this happen? Did Bondi and her team at the Justice Department not understand the legal requirements for interim appointments? That seems unlikely, given that these are supposedly sophisticated legal professionals. Or did they understand the requirements, but choose to ignore them, gambling that they could push these prosecutions through before anyone challenged the underlying authority? Either possibility is deeply problematic. Either we're looking at gross incompetence in understanding basic appointment law, or we're looking at a deliberate decision to circumvent legal requirements in pursuit of political objectives. But Judge Curry's ruling, as damaging as it is, represents only the first blow. The second comes from Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick, who took a careful look at the grand jury proceedings in the Comey case, and what Judge Fitzpatrick found should alarm anyone who understands how the criminal justice system is supposed to function. He described what he discovered as a disturbing pattern of profound investigative missteps. Let's pause on that language for a moment, because federal judges don't throw around phrases like that casually. Judges are trained to be measured and precise in their language. Their written opinions become part of the permanent legal record. They're cited in future cases, analyzed by scholars, read by historians. When a federal judge characterizes conduct as disturbing and describes investigative errors as profound, that judge is deliberately creating a record of serious misconduct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate your leadership of this important subcommittee. Welcome, Attorney General Bondi. It's good to see you. Just yesterday, I met in my office with the advocates who work with survivors of domestic violence in rural Maine. Along with Chairman Moran and other members of this committee, I was one of the lead sponsors of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2022.
This isn't a judge expressing mild concern about minor errors. This is a judge documenting fundamental failures in how a prosecution was conducted. What specifically did Judge Fitzpatrick find? First, he identified fundamental misstatements of law that were presented to the grand jury. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand the role of a grand jury in the federal system. Grand juries are supposed to serve as a critical check on prosecutorial power. They're made up of ordinary citizens who review evidence and determine whether there's probable cause to believe a crime was committed and whether charges should be brought. This is a constitutional safeguard enshrined in the Fifth Amendment, designed to protect individuals from overzealous or politically motivated prosecutions. But here's the thing. Grand jurors aren't lawyers. They rely on prosecutors to explain the law, to tell them what legal standards apply, to help them understand what elements need to be proven for a particular crime. Prosecutors have an obligation, both legal and ethical, to present the law accurately. They're officers of the court. They have a duty of candor. When prosecutors misstate the law to a grand jury, they're not just making innocent mistakes. They're corrupting the entire process, because grand jurors can't properly evaluate evidence if they're applying the wrong legal standards. Judge Fitzpatrick found that prosecutors fundamentally misrepresented legal requirements to the grand jurors in the Comey case. That means the grand jury was making decisions based on incorrect legal information. They may have voted to indict based on evidence that wouldn't actually support charges under the correct legal standards. This isn't aggressive prosecution or creative legal theory. This is misleading the grand jury, which undermines the entire purpose of having grand juries in the first place. Before we continue breaking down these devastating findings, if you're finding this coverage valuable and want to see more in-depth analysis like this, please consider subscribing to The Ethan Show. We're working toward our goal of 10,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps us continue bringing you detailed coverage of these critical legal and political developments. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. But the problems Judge Fitzpatrick identified don't stop with misstatements of law. He also found that potentially privileged material was improperly presented to the grand jury. Legal privilege isn't some technical loophole. It exists to protect fundamental rights and relationships. Attorney-client privilege, for example, protects confidential communications between lawyers and their clients, ensuring that people can seek legal advice candidly without fear that their conversations will be used against them later. When prosecutors bring privileged material before a grand jury, they're violating those protections and potentially tainting the entire proceeding. Think about how this works in practice. If grand jurors see privileged communications they shouldn't have access to, that information can influence their decision-making in ways that fundamentally undermine fairness. They might base their vote on information that should have been excluded, information that could prejudice them against the target of the investigation. Once that bell is rung, you can't unring it. The damage is done. And according to Judge Fitzpatrick, that's exactly what happened here. Privileged material was improperly put before the grand jury. Then we get to what might be the most shocking aspect of Judge Fitzpatrick's findings. He determined that the indictment process was so chaotic and disorganized that it's unclear whether the grand jury ever actually reviewed and approved the final charges that were filed against Comey. Read that again because it's almost hard to believe. In a normal, properly functioning prosecution, prosecutors draft an indictment, present it to the grand jury, the grand jurors review it and vote on whether to approve it, and only then is the indictment officially filed. That's how the system is supposed to work. That's what the Constitution requires. But Judge Fitzpatrick found the process was so jumbled, so poorly managed, that there are legitimate questions about whether this basic procedural requirement was even satisfied. It's possible the indictment was filed without the grand jury ever seeing the final version. If that's what happened, then the charges weren't properly authorized at all. You'd have prosecutors bringing criminal charges against a former FBI director without actually securing grand jury approval, which is a fundamental violation of how federal criminal prosecution is supposed to function. Now, we arrive at perhaps the most explosive and potentially criminal aspect of this entire saga, the security footage. After Judge Fitzpatrick issued orders requiring full disclosure and preservation of evidence, courthouse security cameras captured something remarkable. They captured Attorney General Pam Bondi herself leaving the courthouse while carrying boxes of documents. Not boxes of personal belongings, not boxes of office supplies, boxes containing what appears to be case-related materials, evidence that should have been preserved pursuant to the judge's order. The timing here is absolutely critical and cannot be overstated. The footage shows Bondi exiting with these boxes shortly after the preservation order was issued. And here's where it gets even more damning. Investigators later reported that they could not locate case files that should have been in those very boxes. The timeline matches up perfectly. Judge issues preservation order. Bondi leaves with boxes. Files go missing. The timestamps align. The sequence of events is documented on video. You don't need a law degree to understand how problematic this looks when evidence disappears right after a court orders it to be preserved. And there's video footage of someone carrying boxes containing that evidence out of the courthouse. That's textbook obstruction of justice. This is exactly the kind of conduct that prosecutors routinely charge other people with committing. Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, violation of court orders. These are serious federal crimes that carry significant penalties. Ever be an enemy's list within the Department of Justice? President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General Pam Bondi vowed not to use the U.S. Justice Department to target people based on their politics if she's confirmed for the position. But she dodged direct questions about investigating people scorned by the president-elect during her testimony on Wednesday before the Senate Judiciary Committee considering her nomination. I will not politicize that office. I will not target people simply because of their political affiliation. Now we arrive at perhaps the most explosive aspect of this saga, the security footage after Judge Fitzpatrick issued orders requiring preservation of evidence. Courthouse security cameras captured something remarkable. They captured Attorney General Pam Bondi herself leaving the courthouse while carrying boxes of documents, not personal belongings, boxes containing what appears to be case-related materials that should have been preserved pursuant to the judge's order. The timing is absolutely critical. The footage shows Bondi exiting with these boxes shortly after the preservation order was issued. And here's where it gets even more damning. Investigators later reported they could not locate case files that should have been in those very boxes. The timeline matches up perfectly. Judge issues preservation order. Bondi leaves with boxes. Files go missing. The timestamps align. The sequence of events is documented on video. You don't need a law degree to understand how problematic this looks. When evidence disappears right after a court orders it preserved, and there's video footage of someone carrying boxes containing that evidence out of the courthouse, that's textbook obstruction of justice. This is exactly the kind of conduct that prosecutors routinely charge other people with committing. The irony is staggering. Pam Bondi is the Attorney General of the United States. She is the nation's chief federal law enforcement officer. Her job is to uphold and enforce federal criminal law, including laws against obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. She oversees federal prosecutors who bring charges against people for exactly this type of conduct, and now she appears to have been caught on camera engaging in the very behavior that her department prosecutes others for committing. Defense attorneys across the country are undoubtedly taking notes. Every time a federal prosecutor accuses a defendant of obstructing justice or tampering with evidence, defense counsel can now point to this situation. They can ask, how can you trust the Justice Department's prosecution when the Attorney General herself allegedly removed evidence after being ordered to preserve it? That's not just rhetorical. That's a legitimate argument that could affect case outcomes. When the institution bringing charges has been found to engage in the very conduct it's prosecuting, that damages its credibility profoundly. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger strategic picture. The collapse of these prosecutions represents a spectacular failure of what many call Trump's revenge prosecution agenda. James Comey and Letitia James weren't random targets. Comey led the FBI during the Russia investigation. He authorized inquiries into potential coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia. Trump fired Comey and has repeatedly called him a criminal. Letitia James, as New York's Attorney General, pursued civil fraud investigations into Trump's business empire. She achieved what many thought impossible. She actually held Trump accountable in court, resulting in massive financial penalties. These prosecutions were supposed to be Trump's vindication. Bondi was supposed to deliver convictions that would prove Trump's claims that his critics were the real criminals. They were supposed to send a message to anyone thinking about opposing Trump that if you come after him, he'll use the full power of the federal government to come after you. Instead, what happened? Complete collapse. Not just defeat in court, but judicial findings that the prosecutions were unlawfully conceived and executed from the beginning. Comey and James aren't just walking away. They're walking away vindicated by federal judges who documented they were victims of unlawful political persecution. Anytime someone claims they're criminals, they can point to these rulings and truthfully say, federal judges examined the charges, found they were based on unlawful prosecol appointments and fundamental misconduct, and dismissed everything while documenting the abuse. The credibility damage extends far beyond these specific cases. Bondi is currently involved in numerous other high-profile matters. She's handling the Epstein files, one of the most scrutinized investigations in recent memory. Every decision she makes will now be viewed through the lens of these judicial findings of misconduct. How can the public trust her stewardship when federal judges have found this level of misconduct in other prosecutions she's overseen? Every filing her department submits, every representation her lawyers make, every assurance she provides, all of it is now tainted by these findings. That's the practical reality of having your professional conduct so thoroughly criticized by the federal judiciary. Trust once lost is incredibly difficult to rebuild. Bar associations in multiple states where Bondi is licensed may now initiate investigations. If the security footage shows what it appears to show, an attorney removing evidence after a preservation order, that could constitute grounds for professional discipline up to and including disbarment. Attorneys have been disbarred for far less serious conduct. There's also the possibility of criminal prosecution. Evidence tampering and obstruction of justice are federal crimes that carry prison sentences. While no sitting official would prosecute Bondi now, future administrations or a special counsel could potentially bring criminal charges if the evidence supports them. We're watching the aftermath unfold in real time. Congressional oversight committees will likely hold hearings. Inspector General investigations may follow. That security footage will be analyzed frame by frame. Other prosecutions from Bondi's tenure will face heightened scrutiny from defense attorneys and judges who remember these rulings. The Attorney General, who was supposed to embody law and order, has been exposed as someone whose operation allegedly couldn't follow basic legal procedures and may have engaged in criminal conduct. Trump wanted his Attorney General to prosecute his enemies. Instead, Bondi has handed those enemies vindication while exposing herself to scandal and potential criminal liability. The revenge prosecutions haven't just failed, they've spectacularly backfired, achieving the opposite of their intended purpose. The fallout is only beginning. When you attempt to weaponize the justice system and get caught, the consequences shape how every future action is perceived and judged. That's what's unfolding here, documented in federal court filings and captured on courthouse cameras for everyone to see. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening, drop a heart in the comments if you watched until the end. And don't forget to subscribe to the Public Affairs as we work toward 10,000 subscribers.